Thanks very much, Helen. It's always a bit humbling to hear what you've done read out. It's probably not nearly as much as it sounds. A lot of it is doing the same thing repeatedly in different places, and hopefully getting better at it. So I started World Vision's emergency response in many of the places that Helen mentioned, but I gave up my operational role in about August, September last year. After 20 years of doing operations, I decided it was time for a change of pace. So my job now is basically, as I used to say to the person that held my job before me, or part of my job, actually Rain Paulson, who now works for the UN in DRC, I said, so I do things, and your job is to tell me what I should be doing before I do it and what I've done wrong after I've done it. So now I'm the person that gets to do that, to set the stage, if you like, for the operations. And afterwards, try and explain to the public in general, and indeed peer agencies and colleagues in the United Nations, how World Vision does what it does, why it takes the approaches that it does, focused on its emergency work. So the external relations piece is really about being outward looking, being an ambassador, if you like, for the organization. The resource development piece is about leading a team that tries to generate additional funds for our work, primarily focused on getting additional funds out of the UN system into World Vision's work in various countries. I guess my current role is a lot slower, a lot more measured, a lot more predictable than what I was doing for the previous 20 years. My previous life was determined by events and by things that would happen unpredictably. Sometimes predictably, but mostly unpredictably, and that we would need to respond to. So I'm going to talk mostly about that, about what I did in operations, what I observed, what we've learned as an organization about particularly the focus on women, the impact of emergencies and disasters on women. I want to just set the stage though with a couple of things. First, just people, including, I have to say, people I work with, including myself, we often get confused. What's humanitarian? What's development? What's relief? The best way probably to describe it is development work is about achieving the best that human beings can achieve. So recently, we, as humanity, so through a process led by the UN, adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you read those and if you look at what they're about trying to get the whole of humanity to be the best in terms of provision of education, provision of healthcare, protecting human rights, and so on and so forth. That's not what I do. So that's the aspirational piece. Relief is about making sure that humanity doesn't slip into the bargain basement of what humanity can do. So relief is rooted in international humanitarian law. So if the Sustainable Development Goals set the gold standard for what we want to be as human beings, international humanitarian law really sets the foundation, the floor. We really don't want to go any lower than upholding the basics of international humanitarian law. And a lot of the work that my colleagues continue to do and I used to do in relief work is about making sure that we achieve the bare minimum for people that have suffered the consequences of an earthquake, a cyclone, a conflict, a drought, and so on and so forth. So I'm afraid that because of that, some of what I'm going to talk about is actually quite discouraging. Necessarily, we're dealing with humanity at its worst. So it's going to be uplifting in some ways, but it's going to be challenging in others, because we are in the bargain basement of what human beings really are capable of doing to each other. I'm going to start though by asking you to imagine yourself in a situation, a natural disaster, actually a tsunami. I'm sure there's nobody here that doesn't remember the Indian Ocean tsunami a little over 10 years ago. affected many, many countries. I myself was deployed to Aceh in northern Indonesia. And after I'd been there a few weeks, I was in a helicopter coming back from a field visit, and I asked the pilot, he flew over Banda Aceh, which is the main city in Aceh, and I asked him to fly at the height that the tsunami wave had come in at to that particular part of Aceh, which was 60 feet. So he brought the helicopter down to 60 feet, and we hovered and we looked down. Now 60 feet is actually quite high when you're looking down. Now, people look small, buildings look small. So what I want you to do is close your eyes, if you will. You don't have to, but I invite you to close your eyes and imagine that you're in Banda Aceh and that 60-foot wave is coming in and crashing down on your city. And I want you to imagine that you're an individual. Some of you, perhaps the men, can imagine that you're fishermen. Some of you can imagine that you're farmers. Maybe a mother with young children. A teenage girl. And finally a 20-year-old pregnant woman. And imagine, if you can, what the consequences of that tsunami are for you in that role. So I'll just give you a moment to think about that. Pick a couple of roles if you like. We can probably all relate to being on a beach and seeing waves crashing down, but we probably can't relate to seeing a wave of that magnitude crashing down on our city and destroying everything in its path. So I invite you to open your eyes. You've got that image in your mind. If you're the fisherman, you're probably very lucky because you're out at sea. You perhaps felt a little wave, a little rock, bigger than usual, rock the boat, and you're like, that's interesting, I wonder what that was. So a colleague of mine, a Mexican actually, was on holiday at the time of the tsunami, and he was actually out diving in the ocean at the time the tsunami happened. Had no idea that it had happened. They only found out when they came back to shore later in the day, and as they were approaching shore, witnessed the devastation on shore. This was 6 hours after the tsunami itself. Because they'd been out at sea, they hadn't noticed anything at all. So if you're the fisherman, you've survived. You're out at sea, your boat has ridden a wave that's perhaps a little higher than those you're normally used to, but you're still alive. If you're the farmer, you were probably up in the hills, farming your fields. So you'll have seen something happen, you may have heard it happen, but you'll have looked down on it happening with shock, probably, and horror. But you've also survived. If you're the mother with young kids, you were probably at home. So you didn't see anything coming. You may have been lucky. You may have been able to hold on to something, hold on to a passing tree trunk as the storm surge came in, or maybe as it went out, you've been able to cling on, and you're also alive. But you don't know where your kids are. You've lost them. If you're the teenage girl, let's say you're out taking a walk, going to visit a friend. You find yourself suddenly submerged, but your clothing is long and enveloping and heavy, and it's holding you down. If you're lucky, you've survived. As likely as not, you've perished because your clothing has held you under the water. Finally, the pregnant 20-year-old. Would you like to have a guess? Has she survived or not? So Oxfam did a study in Banda Aceh. They found that women in some villages were 4 times more likely to perish in the tsunami than men. 4 times more likely. Because they were indoors, culture and custom had prevented them from learning how to swim or climb a tree. They didn't see the tsunami coming. Men typically were in the fields, out at sea, which increased their chances of survival. So the sheer matter of whether you're a man or a woman impacts your chances of survival in an event like that. So I want you to imagine another situation now. That's a situation of conflict. Well, you're not going to have to do too much imagining because I actually have a video that I'm going to show you. Some of you may have seen it before. It was made by Save the Children. They ran it, I believe, on ITV and Channel 4 here in the UK for a short period. It was designed to highlight the impact of conflict on young children, in this time a young girl. So I believe Natasha, oh, thank you Natasha, she's going to magically make the first video appear on the screen, and I just invite you to watch it to the end, and you'll have to watch carefully. Some things happen quite quickly on this video.
Happy birthday to you.
Make a wish.
Granny!
Hello.
Have you done your homework?
Ada!
For a general strike.
Ready or not? Here it comes.
Violent clashes with live ammunition against.
Deserve to get shot.
Have a nice day at school.
Airstrikes on rebel position.
We are going to stay.
What's happening?
Go.
Heavy fighting in Richmond.
Dad, where are we?
Rebel forces advance.
Daddy!
Happy birthday to you. Make a wish, darling.
So, and that was quite a hard-hitting video, isn't it? And you recognise a couple of things that are happening in Syria right now to young children, young girls. So she's running through, obviously, a checkpoint, and as she runs through, the door slams behind her and she's separated from her family. And then that, what I consider an awful touch, you see a grandmother, tugging her cheek like that when she's having her birthday party, and then you see the soldier doing the same gesture, radically different meanings and undertones. So the reason I wanted you to imagine what it's like to be a victim in the tsunami, and the reason I wanted you to see that video was basically to bring home the fact that disasters don't affect everybody equally. Some of the impacts are equal on men and women, girls and boys, but the impacts of disasters, particularly on women and girls, are very, very different from the impacts on boys and men. I have another video that I'm going to show you, and that is some of the children of Syria talking about what it's meant for them to be victims of the conflict in Syria right now. So let's watch that one. It's also another couple of minutes.
شفت انه بصير ضرب والعالم هيك بتموت وشي عالم محترقة هاي.
لعمي ما شهيد من الحرب ومن الضرب. صرنا أنا صرت ناديله يا أبا. كان في أخواتي وأنا والبابا والماما. هن بسوريا. بخاف يموتوا. لا سمح الله. أنا شفت الصاروخ يوم قام ينزل. لقيت هيك السبب هيك. زدنا غزيفة. خفنا. وقام بي أخذنا لمطرح بعيد. تجي طياد يقع عليهم البيت.
أحلى شجر بحياتي يعني شفته والعصافير والطيور والهيدي بسد بيتي. يعني هلا الطيور فتصل بالجوع ما في حدا بطعميهم، الشجر يبس ما في حدا بشربه. يعني أنا أول شي هيك مثل الحلم، يعني أنا هلا يعني شفتها هيك مثل الحلم.
يعني شيء يجي عليهم الطياد يزيد عليهم، شيء تغصفهم برصاص.
إلي مش شايفة عبير سنة.
ارجع على بلدي وعلى المدرسة على رفاقي.
حاسة لا ما شفت شي، بس وقت أهلي هيك تأثرت علي كتير أوي.
بحبوني ولا بحبون كتير.
So that one's particularly poignant because we're actually entering right now the 6th year of the conflict in Syria. The 6th year of that kind of thing. So we'll come back to conflict. I want to go into natural disasters in a little more detail, talk about what the impact is of natural disasters. So what are the kinds of things that happen when there's an earthquake, when there's a cyclone or a hurricane? The kinds of things that happen are people lose their homes. It goes without saying, in an earthquake, homes are damaged. We saw that in Nepal. People can lose their livelihoods if land is flooded, if markets are destroyed, businesses are destroyed. Families can become separated, as I mentioned earlier. In the context of the tsunami, the mother's children may have survived. There was a story in the media actually just last year of a mother and child that were reunited after being separated for 10 years. I believe that was in Aceh. 10 years of separation as a result of the tsunami. And of course, hunger, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes disease. Most of these consequences of disaster apply more or less equally to everybody. But there are some particular additional impacts on women. So let's start with needs related to reproductive health. If you imagine the Nepal earthquake, many pregnant women found themselves outside of the hospitals that they'd been in and facing the prospect of childbirth, possibly childbirth with complications, without hospital facilities to look after them. Once they've given birth, women need support with lactation, with breastfeeding, something that can be very difficult after you've gone through a traumatic event. Women have specific sanitation needs, something that the international community is not very good at talking about or dealing with, but something that half of the human population has to deal with as a result of being women affected by emergencies. Women tend to be more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse as a result of a natural disaster. And finally, if a woman has the misfortune to lose her husband and become a widow, in many cultures she loses her status. She becomes essentially invisible, with nobody to care for her and look after her. I want to give you a couple of examples of things that I've seen in my own experience. The first from Aceh. So I already mentioned, as a woman in Aceh, in some villages, you are 4 times more likely to die as a result of the tsunami than as a man. That's from a study by Oxfam. Some of the reasons I mentioned, some of them are cultural, things that restrict behavior for women. Not learning to swim, for example, not being able to climb a tree. But you know, there's a double whammy that applies to women in a situation like that. Many homes were destroyed. You'll remember the images. Many parts of Aceh that were affected by the tsunami were simply flattened. Everything disappeared. Everything. Including the land registry. And all its records were washed out to sea. So now, imagine you're that widowed, or that widow, and you're seeking to establish title on your property to get your land back that you've lost, your building that you've lost. as a result of the tsunami. Typically, in that culture, women are less educated, less literate, less confident, because they've not typically had to navigate bureaucracy and public services. The men in their families have done that for them. So widows are particularly vulnerable because the loss of documentation makes it particularly hard for them to re-establish themselves, to secure the title to their land, to rebuild their home, and to rebuild their livelihood. And of course, it just piles on because that makes them then subject to unscrupulous lenders or offers of help which are equally unscrupulous. In Haiti, I was in Haiti for a short period after the earthquake. Let me read you a quote from a study on the impact, a study done by the UK government actually, on the impact of the earthquake in Haiti on women. It says, women in Haiti spoke about how the trauma of the earthquake was compounded by the inhuman conditions in the camps, particularly lack of privacy and poor sanitation. Something we take for granted. Something we take for granted even in this building is that there are sanitary facilities segregated for men and women. A woman can go and use those facilities without fear that there may be a man lurking in the corner about to do something unspeakable to her. That wasn't the case in Haiti, particularly in the early days, before the international response and the national response really got going. Women were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and the impact of poor sanitation facilities. You know, I would say though, with Haiti, I used to live in Haiti in the late 90s. That was not too different before the earthquake, actually. And I'll come back to this point about the fundamentals that exist before an emergency and the consequences on those fundamentals after the emergency. In fact, one of my colleagues who hadn't been to Haiti before, when I arrived, she'd been there a couple of weeks, and she was describing to me all the horrible things that she'd seen. And I said, yeah, said, it's pretty much what I saw 10 years ago. And she was shocked. So as I look around, the only difference I see in Haiti really is that there are piles of rubble everywhere. The fundamentals are the same, the lack of sanitation facilities, the terrible lot for women in that country. So let's talk about conflict in a little more detail. Again, the experience of conflict for men and women in many regards is similar, as you saw in the video. The whole family is affected by that growing conflict. So some of the things that happen in conflict, obviously, the most obvious, people get killed. So they become victims of the armed conflict themselves. But there's also conscription. That affects boys and girls particularly. Separation of families, as we saw in the video. Something as simple as somebody not being able to get through a checkpoint and losing contact with the rest of their family. Displacement. We see this a lot in, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country in almost, or parts of the country, in almost constant conflict. Families moving repeatedly, trying to keep ahead of the conflict that's coming to them. And of course, in conflict, typically basic services grind to a halt. And that affects everybody. When education stops, it affects boys and girls equally. When health centres close, that affects men, women, boys and girls equally. But there are some important differences, because armed conflict, and it was hinted at, I think, in that clip, it exacerbates the inequalities that are already existing in society. So domestic violence increases. As stress increases, domestic violence increases. And conflict causes stress, puts massive stress on families. So domestic violence, of course, women are typically the recipients of domestic violence, and men are typically the perpetrators, not exclusively, but typically. Sexual violence. I have a list here of types of sexual violence, I'm afraid. It's a shortened list. I didn't want to read out a full list because it's, again, one of those things that is just absolutely terrible to contemplate. So rape, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy. something that happens a lot with female child soldiers, and human trafficking. Day-to-day tasks, such as caregiving, a burden that typically falls on women in many societies, become much more difficult to achieve. As public services stop, the public places where those public services took place become more dangerous. Detention and disappearance typically affects men. Men are detained and are disappeared, or killed, if you like, much more frequently than women. But back to that point of what happens to a woman when the husband or the father in the family is disappeared. She becomes much more vulnerable, because in many societies the relationship of women is linked to their, or the status of women, beg your pardon, is linked to their relationship with men. It's something that we find increasingly difficult to contemplate, I think, in this country, in most countries in Western Europe. But that's still the reality for many, many, many women on this planet. Child marriage increases. Sometimes child marriage is used as a way to deal with the threat of rape. I've got an extract, I've got some quotes from a father who has experienced that, which I'll read out in a few moments. Child marriage can be classed again as a double disaster. When a young girl gets married, she typically stops going to school, reduces her earning potential, increases the chances of her having child after child after child, which results in its own health issues. These are losses in disasters that are less measured. They're often intangible. It's easy to quantify how many houses were destroyed. It's much harder to quantify how many years of education have been lost because girls have been married off when they were 12, 13, 14 years old. When I was in Afghanistan, I went to a school that was in a tent. It was one of those tents. It looked a bit like those greenhouses that you just have a metal frame and you put plastic over the top. That's what this was, except the plastic was white, so the sun couldn't shine through. And girls and boys were going to school inside that tent. Had that tent not been placed there, had those boys and girls not been able to go to that school, they would have lost their access to education. That was in the aftermath of the conflict in the early 2000s, or what some would call the invasion in the early 2000s. Closer to home, let's go back to Syria. So Syria is entering its 6th year of conflict right now, this month. 6 years. 8.5 million children are affected by the conflict. 8.5 million. Half of whom are girls. So that's 4.2 million girls directly affected by conflict within a few hours' flight of here. 86,000 children in Syria are acutely malnourished. 86,000. Now, being acutely malnourished is important because it increases your risk of early death by a factor of 9 or 10. So that's 86,000 children in Syria. Syria, which was a thriving, prospering, basically middle-class country, now has 86,000 children at acute risk of death through malnutrition. 2 million children don't attend school. These numbers are mind-boggling, aren't they? Was it Stalin said, 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic? We can't get numbed and blinded by the numbers, right? But it is hard to comprehend how 2 million people, 2 million children can stop going to school. That number went up by 400,000 last year. So that's more than the population of Bracknell, right? Suddenly stop going to school because of the conflict. Refugees have lost their homes, they've lost their livelihoods, as we saw in the second video there. In Jordan, many of the refugees don't have registration papers. Because they don't have registration papers, they're afraid to report incidences of violence to the authorities because that puts them in contact with the police. So you can imagine what that does then to the situation of a vulnerable woman who is afraid to go to the authorities with her story. So why does this all happen? As I've hinted at, it's not so much the disaster, It's the existing inequalities and discrimination, the lack of opportunity that are there before the emergency are simply exacerbated by the emergency, whether that's a natural disaster or a conflict. A colleague of mine in Haiti said the earthquake didn't only open the earth, it opened the fault lines in our society. Fault lines that were already, I have to say, pretty significant, were further opened and laid bare. So the everyday inequalities are inequalities that already create risk and reduce life chances for girls, and they're just exacerbated by the emergency. So go back to the Oxfam study, the situation that women face, the increased likelihood of death. If we go to Nepal, the earthquake in Nepal last year, before the earthquake, 15,000 women and girls were trafficked every single year out of Nepal, mostly into bonded labour or forced prostitution in surrounding countries, or a particular surrounding country, India specifically. 40% of women in Nepal are married before their 18th birthday. So imagine what the earthquake did to that situation, where trafficking is already rife. The earthquake and the chaos and confusion and the lack of opportunity that ensues increases the risk of trafficking. Where early marriage is rife, the economic challenges that families face after an emergency increases the risk of early marriage. Imagine if 40% of girls in this country were married before their 18th birthday. I wonder what we'd say about that. So our job, I'm conscious that this is quite heavy stuff, so let's talk about what we can do about it for a little bit. Our job is to do what we can to improve each of those situations. Our job is to make sure that when people find themselves at the very lowest ebb, we can lift them up a little bit and then a little bit more and a little bit more still. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One is a video, and the other I'm going to read you the story that I mentioned earlier from the father who gave his daughter into early marriage, and as a consequence what he's doing now. So let's see the video first if we can.
Kanon na dyan kong atin sa West kay para daghan ko makatunan. Nga informasyon ba kabahin sa kanang pagpatutoy, mga klase-klase.
Nakuan bitaw murag maluag-luag sad among dughan nga napagawas namo ang among kuan. Ibati ato nga hitabo.
Nakakaaliw o parang nakalimutan mo yung problema mo na may bagyong dumaan kahit wasak na wasak yung bahay niyo.
Nagpo-provide kami ng health information at health education sa mga mothers para may matutunan sila para sa mga anak nila at magkaroon sila ng space kung saan mai-express nila yung sarili nila, yung naranasan nila sa bagyo, yung mga naranasan ng mga anak nila at ng pamilya nila.
Sa weeks, salamat kasi dumating kayo. Malaking tulong sa amin to, sa aming pamilya, sa mga bata o sa gaya ko na buntis. Na kapag nailuwal na to, syempre may maituturo ako na galing sa inyo.
Na-apply na ko kung sa mga na-lecture, na-apply na ko sa among kuan panimalay sa akong kaugalingon.
So I chose that example and this following one deliberately because often when people think of relief work, they think of people handing things out, right? Food, tarpaulins, even airdrops, dropping stuff into relief camps. But this is equally important, right? Providing spaces for women and young children to come together and gather, talk about their problems and get help. And as you can see, this is an area, or this is a sector that loves acronyms, so you now have a new acronym, AWAKE, Women and Young Child Space. So we also have CFS, a child-friendly space. I always ask my colleagues what a child-unfriendly space looks like, but apparently child-friendly space is the big thing. So that's essentially a child-friendly space it's a school without schooling. It's a place for children to get together and spend time together, but they don't receive formal education. So in this case, the women and young children space. Very, very important kinds of services that we can provide. Here's another example. So Gadia, not her real name, was 13 years old when her father arranged for her to marry her cousin. So he said, many times I saw how men were looking at my daughter, and I was afraid she would get abused. Once a man followed her home to our tent. This, by the way, is a family in Lebanon that have fled Syria. Thankfully, I was home, he says. So I knew her cousin wanted to marry her, so I forced her to, because I was afraid to lose her. It's a decision he now deeply regrets. Gadia's now husband and mother-in-law beat her, and she's often covered in bruises. The father says, I feel very guilty. My wife is angry with me. I swear that I wanted to protect her. I did not know that this would happen. I'm a father of daughters, and I can barely conceive of living with that. Wanting the best, but actually creating the worst for your child. Sometimes, he says, I think of killing myself as I'm the one responsible for this marriage. As if to agree, his wife chimes in. He wouldn't listen. I begged, but he wouldn't listen. She was too young. Gadia is now 15. She visits her parents and younger siblings once a week in their tent in a settlement in the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. She says it's the only time she feels happy. A quote from her, I didn't want to get married. I was too young. I miss my family, my friends, my school. I asked my husband if I could go back to school, but he said no. I wanted to be a lawyer. If I got the chance now, I'd specialize in making sure other girls don't have to experience what I have experienced. She fears becoming pregnant, saying she's not ready psychologically or physically. I have to look after my husband's large family. I work very hard. I'm tired. I just want to go back to Syria and rest. Her mother says that prior to her marriage, Gadia was a warm and happy child that loved to eat candy floss. Now she's somber and withdrawn. To ensure other parents don't push their daughters into similar circumstances, Gadia's mother now serves on a child protection committee, raising awareness in refugee settlements about the negative impact of early marriage. So again, another intervention, a protection intervention, to raise awareness to prevent, or hopefully prevent, other families from making the same mistake that Gadia's family made. And this is a story, well, it's not a story, it's a real life situation from an interview that some of our staff did for a report on the consequences of the Syria conflict on just a few of those millions of children that have been affected. So trying to get away from those statistics and put a face and a personal story on the consequences of war. So, what do we make of all of this? Where do we get to in our thinking? What is the reason that disasters are affecting women differently? Well, I'd say that the solutions to the issue of the impact of disasters on women actually lie in development, not in relief. So in things like the Sustainable Development Goals, our attempt as human beings to lift our game, to do the best we can for vulnerable people on this planet. And the reason I say that is that societies that discriminate based on gender tend to experience less rapid economic growth and decreased poverty reduction than societies that treat males and females more equally. Or, as a colleague of mine put it to one of our staff in Pakistan when they were discussing this subject, you're only using half of your brains. Now when she first said that, I'm like, wow, he was probably a bit offended at that. you're calling him stupid. She said, no, what I meant was all those women's minds in that country are not getting utilized. They're not realizing their potential. They're not contributing because of the discrimination, the gender-based discrimination in that society. Healthy societies do disaster response better. So if you look at what Australia does when it's faced with the massive fires that they periodically face, they do well. They organize, they mobilize, and they do better than a country like Pakistan. I hesitate to bring up the USA, but I do so because the USA is actually one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, if not the most disaster-prone. So why is it that in living memory you can only think of really one or two disasters that have really made the headlines for how badly it's gone? Because the USA does disaster response well. There's a direct link between development and inclusion in a society and how they respond to disasters. So diversity and inclusion are keys to resilience and growth. But when disaster strikes, there's also a need for organizations like my own to do the right thing. Right? I don't want to stand here and say they need to do A, B, and C without addressing what humanitarian agencies like World Vision, like ADRA, like the Red Cross, indeed like the United Nations can do. So some of the things that we can do are things like having a gender advisor on the team. Somebody whose job it is to ask difficult questions about gender in emergencies. So, water and sanitation colleagues, typically engineers, overwhelmingly men. Have they really thought about the projects they're designing and the impact those projects have on the women that they're serving? That's the kind of thing that a gender advisor does. We can do better by gathering age and sex disaggregated data. It's amazing how little we do that. Right? We just talk about the number of people affected. So how many of those are men, how many are women, how many are boys, how many are girls? If we started doing that more effectively, and we're trying, we would do much better at targeting our interventions, particularly for women and girls. Consulting women and girls separately from men. Again, thinking about the nature of many of the societies we work in. If you get a mixed group, unlike I'm sure in this group, women are not going to ask questions and they're typically not going to contribute to a conversation when men are present. So having separate meetings for men and women, boys and girls, is very important. And finally, identifying and using the capacities and organizations that are already there. It's important, and I hope I haven't done this, but it's important not to see women or indeed anybody affected by disasters simply as vulnerable, passive, helpless victims. They're not. That is how things tended to be viewed probably in the 1980s in our sector. It's actually how things were viewed when I started working in this sector a little over 20 years ago. Women were a problem waiting for a solution. Then things changed. In the 1990s, our sector went through a phase of seeing women more in terms of their capacity and agency. We went through a phase of including women, redistributing power to women. Then men became the problem. That's how things were seen in Haiti, and I'm going to finish with a short story from Haiti, an observation of some things I saw there. So current thinking and practice in what we do needs to recognize not only women's vulnerabilities, but women's resilience as well. And not only men's capacities and resilience, but also their vulnerabilities. In other words, a truly gender inclusive approach to what we do. So if we can unpack a gender and age aware approach, if we can truly practice that as humanitarians, then we'll be doing the right thing by all the people that we serve. At the moment, we're underserving the women and girls that are victims of natural disaster, and conflict. So incorporating not only gender, but issues as well as sexual orientation and indeed sexuality in general into disaster response. It's something we don't really think about. But you know, I met the very first person I'd met from a disaster situation who identified as transgender just a few months ago at a meeting in Geneva, an Eritrean, told an amazing story, which I'll repeat quickly for you, of her transition from being a refugee from Eritrea to Sudan, finally to Malta. So this is the story she told. Very eloquent, by the way. I think this person is going to be a future Secretary General of the United Nations. Right? She's one to watch. So she found herself in a refugee camp. At that point, she still identified as a male. A refugee camp in Sudan. And at that point, started to realize that in terms of sexuality, he was different from everybody around. So decided, as a result of that, because she was in a society that didn't really have means of coping with that reality, to move away from her family, to protect the rest of her family. She found herself traveling through Africa, through the Sahel, and eventually arrived in Libya. And in Libya, she came across an organization that helped her both deal with her sexuality and deal with her status as a refugee and ultimately an asylum seeker. Not before she'd spent a year in bonded labour on a farm in Libya. But they managed to help her out of that situation and actually got her to Malta, where she still lives. And she was thrilled to bits that she arrived in Malta, and as she said, in a place where gender differences are celebrated, accepted, aren't really a problem. Fantastic ending to the story, except she said, remember, I'm Eritrean, and in Malta they really don't accept Africans. So she overcame that huge burden of being a transgender person in a culture that really doesn't accept them, to find herself in a situation where now her race is the problem. But you know, she rose above that, and she's continuing to fight that and be an example of how being different, and back to my point of how being different, being inclusive, being embracing of diversity builds a strong society. So that's what she's currently trying to do in Malta, God bless her. And I wish her well. I think she's going to pop up in some senior positions in the United Nations in 20 years' time. Let me wrap up there with a video, a final video on the theme of what kind of world we'll have if we can truly make it a world that is safe and welcoming for all women and all girls. So let's put on the last video if we can, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have and answer any queries from anything I might have said.
Look. Over here. What do you see? Poverty, hunger, and violence? Do you see a girl who will suffer neglect and injustice? Do you see a future or just a burden and a victim? Do you even see me? Let me tell you what I see. I see a world where my mother survives my birth. She sees me live way past 5. I see a world where I don't walk all day to find clean water. Instead, I go to school. I marry later, have healthy children, and I learn to be a leader. I see a world where I own a business, I support my family, and I invest in my community. I see a world where I am empowered to use my voice and people listen. Do you see what I see? My strength, my potential, my hope, my future. Now, do you see me? Believe in me, and together we can build a stronger world.
So there you have it. Strong women, strong world. Not that difficult.